I'll have you know, Peter, that the duck is one of the most noble, agile, and intelligent creatures of the animal kingdom.
But they're wimpy. They don't even have teeth.
Neither do hockey players.
We've got old friend Todd Mackey in the house today, coming at us from, where are you at anyway, Buffalo?
No, thank goodness. I mean, I love Buffalo, don't get me wrong. All your listeners here from Buffalo, mighty taco all the way. No, I'm based in Providence, Rhode Island, or just outside of Providence. So
Okay.
a little further east.
I guess, is that why your screen name says Providence on it, I guess?
I mean, that'd be an indicator, sure, yeah.
Yeah, that's, I don't really remember, like, that area as much. I don't know if we ever got there a ton on tour or whatever.
It's probably unlikely, to be honest. I mean, like, Rhode Island is the smallest state in the U.S.
Okay.
So geographically speaking, like the furthest distance you can drive corner to corner, and you're probably taking a bit of a loop, like you're really fluffing it out, is like 90 minutes. I mean, you're not, I mean, by most major, at least U.S. metropolitan standards, Providence is a suburb to Boston. So the closest major city is Boston. It's probably, on an average day without too much traffic, you're driving 45 minutes from here and you're in downtown Boston.
Yeah. Okay.
And then, the other one is New York, which is, just a few hours south on 95.
Yeah. So that's actually that's kind of a nice in between and close to big cities, but I mean, you're not in it, so you probably don't have to deal with as much like the traffic and stuff. But even just thinking of like shows or events kind of thing, you kind of have a lot of selection in that regards.
Oh, for sure. I mean, there's no better place to come up in punk and hardcore than the Northeast, at least that I could understand. I mean, maybe Southern California, maybe the Pacific Northwest at a certain time, but like I grew up 2 some odd hours west of here in the Hartford area in Connecticut. Another tiny state that most people, far as you are away from here, don't have a particular like memory or resolution of. But the reality was that like 2 hours north we're in Boston, 2 hours south we're in New York City, and then like we had just such a vibrant scene because the punk and hardcore scene was like, I mean, think like Back to Youth of Today was a band essentially out of Connecticut, and so, there were venues that were supporting this scene, like all that way back. And it's not to say I was there during the heyday at that time, but, right when I started going to shows, I mean, there was an ebb and flow to the scene, but it was already totally established.
Yeah.
And most in the busiest of seasons, like towards the end of my years in high school and, right as like I was getting active in bands, I mean, you could go to 3 or 4 shows a week. And some of those nights you had to choose like which show you were going to go to, because you could either go this way for that or that way for this other one, so yeah, it was definitely connected. And as a band, you could play a weekend, you could play Boston, Providence, New York, and I mean, you're only driving 5 hours, but you're in like 3 totally legitimate self-standing markets, which for you guys out in the prairies, I mean, that's an impossibility, right? Yeah,
I mean, you can play a lot of small town, little farming communities, but it's not going to make much for you as a band. So yeah,
sure,
that's awesome. I just realized I forgot to hit record on my end here. So what we were just talking about is just where Todd's from, Providence, Rhode Island, and just kind of talking about being between Boston and New York and connection with music there. So my apologies for cutting out before. But so today we're talking about Victory Records, and so let's just get right into it. What's the first time you remember hearing about Victory Records? Do you remember what band it was or what release it was?
Interestingly enough, I mean, I was introduced to Victory Records. I have to imagine, I mean, so it was common to go to shows and if it weren't like Rick, who fronted the band 25 to Life, it was someone else who had a distro. And the most common thing like that unified a lot of us in the mid to late 90s, as we were getting into the scene, was, ordering records from the Victory catalog, right? So, I remember I remember vividly being like, oh man, am I ordering this Donuts record or Cast Iron Hike? And like, at the time I'm like thinking like, oh man, these are two bands. I have no clue. Do I go with like what seems almost like a silly name? Do I go with something that's more serious? And, on from there. So, a couple of the records that would be in my 5 would be the ones that were more definitively like my entry, to Victory. But, Buried Alive and Snapcase, I mean, those were the records that for me were the first like definitive Victory records. And of course, from there, like Earth Crisis and Strife and that whole scene, the California takeover, that was what I thought of Victory. And obviously, it doesn't hurt that the logo was a bulldog and totally matched, but from there, I mean, obviously Victory went on a number of, you can't say like tangents, but I mean, they branched out massively with various trends. So, but for me, it was always the kind of aggro mid 90s hardcore that when I got into Victory, that was the stuff that I really relied on them to bring to the table, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And it's cool that your selections, I'm glad you picked the ones you did, because, a lot of them kind of come from that earlier part of Victory. Yeah, like you've said, it's a very diverse record label now, like they kind of went through the whole kind of pop rock thing and also the post-hardcore screamo, and now I think it's kind of just all over the place, which is because there's been so much time and I mean, there's been so much that's happened over the years with Victory, with lawsuits and bans and all that nonsense. So we're going to scrap all that and just keep it positive and talk about the good stuff. But tons of great bands on this label. As I was going through the roster this week and I was like, man, like there's so many standout bands, and lots of different genres too. And so, really, really cool to get to talk about it with you. And so let's get right to it. So the first one we're going to talk about is Hatebreed's Satisfaction is the Death of Desire. So this is the debut studio album by American metalcore band Hatebreed. It was released on November 11th, 1997 through Victory. This was the band's breakthrough album, with the majority of critics praising it, even calling it a hardcore classic. It lifted them out from the underground scene, and thanks to the rise and fame they got, a record deal with Universal Records. So do you remember the first time that you heard this album and kind of like what it made you feel?
I mean, Hatebreed has this special place for me because, they're a Connecticut band. So I grew up in Connecticut.
Right.
Going to shows. I mean, Jamie booked a lot of my various bands' first shows, or the first shows that mattered. I mean, even some of the silliest, like, I mean, I remember a show he booked, Life in Your Way onto, which was like, I don't know, like Incantation and Goat Horror or some crazy death metal show that we played.
Perfect. You guys fit right in.
Yeah, it was. I mean, we're home anywhere, but yeah, I think especially with his time. I mean, he put out the With Honor demo and was always a huge advocate. I mean, this obviously is after Satisfaction broke and when he constantly reinvested in the scene. But yeah, I don't think, there wasn't a time where all of a sudden I had the record and it was like not a concept, because they were always around. I mean, Hatebreed played every show with anyone who mattered, in those years leading up, and they were beloved. I mean, so it was more like, if I'm honest, and it might be my age, which you share more or less, it might be looking back and saying, yeah, I don't know. It almost is sewn into the entire fabric of like my sense of my own personal hardcore landscape, like all the way back to the beginning. I'm not like a huge, like, kind of aggro hardcore dude. That was never my vibe. But there's something about Hatebreed, and it was this album that did it first with like the opening track, Empty Promises, when, Jamie's saying, how can you save yourself, or how can you save me when you can't even save yourself? And it's like, there's so many anthemic lines that have come since that just, I don't know, they make you feel like 10 feet tall and superhuman. And it was that feeling, and then seeing them explode,
Yeah.
that I feel like this record became emblematic of how much potential there was to impact people and to like create a vibe. And yeah, and I mean, to see Jamie and that crew as business people, you know, just like put their elbows out and make a way. And I mean, I still think he is without a doubt like one of the sharpest, you know, music business minds. I mean, it's unbelievable to me what they've been able to do. So, you know, this was really the advent of that, you know, that career, you know, all the things that led to like Headbangers Ball host, and, you know, just unbelievably massive tours, and a following well beyond bands that were like, you know, mainstream and major label that should have had followings, you know, that exceeded theirs. But yeah, years later, With Honor would open for them. You know, they were gracious enough to take us out, you know, handfuls of times, and it was insane. I mean, they would play some club in like, you know, random tertiary city in South Carolina, and I mean, there'd be 2,000, 3,000 people there just freaking out. And, you know, I think it's how catchy it is, and it's how just how I don't know, it sort of pulls some sort of spirit out of your chest, and you know, shows you who you are in a lot of ways, at least for me. Was that an album that you got into and that you have that memory for? I feel like it might be.
Well, it actually isn't. So I mean, it's so cool hearing kind of how you came up. I mean, I knew they were from that area, but I just kind of forgot. And so it's so cool that you kind of had that connection and saw them come up and kind of got to, you know, come up with them. I don't think I actually got into them probably until Perseverance. When this album came out, like, yeah, it was a 1997. I was still like pretty much straight into like skate punk and pop punk and stuff, and, you know, kind of getting a little bit into some heavier stuff like Stretch Armstrong and kind of the more hardcore punk, but not necessarily the kind of more straight up hardcore stuff. And so, yeah, it wasn't until Perseverance came out. I mean, also at that time, like, I wouldn't have had the internet. And so, you know, I just whatever was kind of in magazines I was reading, or, you know, and being in a small town, right? Like, everything kind of took a bit longer to kind of get down the pipeline. And so, yeah, I don't even know if I knew of Hatebreed until Perseverance came out.
Oh yeah, no, I imagine. I mean, they were touring it really hard, you know, but I have to imagine. I mean, Western Canada didn't really open up that way, at least for U.S. bands, until even, I don't know, like 03, 04, 05. I mean, I feel like, you know, it was a few bands that just really kind of anchored the scene out there that started to bring bigger tours through, and kind of, especially for that, you know, Winnipeg, Regina, Edmonton, Calgary area.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, even when With Honor started in, you know, 2000, 2001, I mean, it was like, I mean, that wasn't an area that we thought we could get to, you
Right.
know?
Yeah.
So,
And I mean,
so that makes sense.
yeah, and there was definitely smaller, you know, communities and shows. And yeah, like the town I was in, I was 4 hours from either Regina or Winnipeg. So a lot of times, like, even if I did know of a show, like, it didn't necessarily mean I could go to it. But yeah, it's actually, with this, one memory I'll always have with this album is Matt, so who played in Means. He got this album, and so we would listen to it, and I think his dad found it. So like, we were at his parents' place, and his dad had, I think, taken like our band van at the time, to go fill it with gas for us or something. And we came back into the van, the CD was like just like thrown on the floor kind of thing. Cause I think the CD booklet was in there, you know, with the explicit lyrics or whatever.
Sure.
And so I'll always think of just getting a kick and be like, oh man, sorry, that kind of sucks your dad found that. But like, I don't know if his dad actually said anything. He just took out the CD player and threw it on the floor. But
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. You know, it's funny because, I mean, before I knew, I mean, like when I started, I first couple of shows I went to, I mean, people were out in Hatebreed gear. I mean, it was like, you know, they were a presence already in, you know, before this 95, 96. And, you know, or at least, you know, I mean, it just seemed like, because I grew up in northern Connecticut, so I was going to shows in like Western Mass, Northampton, Agawam, and they were playing up there, and so exact time frames I feel like are fuzzy, but I mean I just remember seeing their gear around, seeing their name, and yeah, they were just the heaviest, like just most in your face. And then like going to the first couple shows I saw them, I mean, it was insane. I was scared for my life, and not insane like, people literally trying to hurt each other. It's just like, yeah, it's moshing and like just energy on a level that, I had never experienced. And so, yeah, I think the coolest thing was just how Connecticut they were. And we were all so stoked and so proud, for them just exploding after this record. I mean, and into Perseverance, it's like they go from a band that put this out on a club show, like a club show CD release. And then they were like doing Ozfest, only a couple years later, it seemed. And, but then they'd always do like, secret special guest shows at all the craziest small local venues. And, Jamie was always booking shows. I mean, he was all over the world and he was still like booking Connecticut full time,
Yeah, that's rad.
So yeah, there's obviously a huge debt that anybody who's into punk and hardcore in the Northeast, but specifically Connecticut, I mean, that we owe, all of those guys, but Jamie especially.
Yeah. Have you kept up kind of with the rest of their discography?
Yeah, I mean, I listen to stuff here and there. I would say that in general, like I'm kind of, it's off my radar a bit, in the last like 5-10 years. So
Yeah.
I'm not super up on what's going on, but that's just like life in general. I mean, you have kids and, you start having to like pay attention to like the myriad of things that come with a totally different sort of position in life that way. And
yeah, for sure.
and in general, like, my musical tastes, they haven't changed. I mean, I love punk and hardcore, and there's like various records, even that have come out within the last year that I'm, completely into. But I feel like the things that really turn my head are like fewer and further between,
Yeah. Well, they put out an awesome album just at the end of last year. I think it maybe came out in November. And yeah, like they're one of those bands that I always like. I haven't paid like super close attention to them. I mean, I'll always check out their albums, but this last one, for whatever reason, just was like, man, it just hit at the right time. Maybe just because it was kind of at the end of the year, there was less releases coming out. But yeah, there's some really, really killer songs on that. And it's just cool to see that they're still staying heavy. It's still the same band, even the same logo. You see it and you know what to expect. And I like that out of music. Most of the bands I love kind of stick to a sound, and so yeah,
Sure.
I like when you kind of know what to expect. But yeah, awesome. Yeah, moving on is a Snapcase Progression Through Unlearning, which was recorded and mixed in a period of 2 weeks with producer Steve Evans. The guitarist John Salemi recorded the album with full-blown chicken pox. Lucky him. And noted that the album's recording was very, very quick. The album was released April 1997. The album is considered to be revolutionary by many fans of hardcore. What do you think of that?
I mean, I remember hearing Caboose on some sampler, some Victory sampler, and I tried ahead of this episode to figure out what that was, and I couldn't nail it down. I don't have any of that stuff anymore.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't figure out, like I was searching the internet trying to figure out like what it must have been. But regardless, I mean, there was three things that song and then this album just crushed me on first listen. And I heard that song and I heard the snare drum, and I grew up playing drums. So my first instrument are drums, and then I played guitar, and then I sang, for a band. But like I heard the snare and I was just like, man,
Like the high pitched kind of pingy snare.
yeah, it was like it became definitive, in this kind of like it wasn't quite a piccolo, it must have been metal brass or something, but it just cut, and it was so punchy. And that combined with these like really mechanical sounding guitars and riffs, that's super dissonant but very like rhythmic and very precise, rhythm type licks and riffs. And that, and then, Daryl's voice on top of that, where you're just like, man, is that a human being? Like,
Yeah, it's very
what's
unique.
going on? All of that just set this tone where I was like, man, I've never heard anything like this. And then the lyrics just blew me away. And it's funny because going back to it, there are ideas that I feel like this record, put on my radar as a young person that I had no idea how to appreciate fully. And now looking back, and especially as a parent, I'm like, man, what an amazing perspective to gain. I mean, like, the whole freedom from within concept, just like getting to like that. Caboose is like all about connecting to yourself, getting past like, the things other people expect of you and think of you. And I mean, that to me became over time in hardcore became almost stock. But at that time, like, I had never really been confronted with that. And to be confronted with that at such energy, and then, to get into this record and to go see them play, and you're just like, dude, I mean, unbelievably tight band, insane energy, and people just freaking out connecting over this type of content. I mean, this was like the first record I remember being, convinced that hardcore was it for me. And I kind of didn't look back from there. Like, it defined what I came to expect, and what I wanted to bring as a lyricist, and also like as a musician in a band, like what I expected the singer in that band to contribute. It had to matter. It had to be from that person's core, or like why,
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I look back now and I'm like, oh yeah, no, that is hardcore. But, I mean, it wasn't until bands like, Snapcase in this case, but, a variety of other bands really released this type of material and made it that way.
Yeah, and it's so unique. Like, even just comparing it with a band like Hatebreed, both bands would be in that hardcore realm, but just such a different take on the aggression and the emotion and dynamic. And this was another one that I didn't know of until I saw them on the End Transmission tour cycle. And I just remember, I don't even think I wouldn't have known much of them. I went to see I think they were on tour with Hope's Fall. And so I went to see Hope's Fall, and I think actually Snapcase was headlining, and it just like, there was something about the way they played live, and like, it was so intense, but it's really dynamic. Like, it was, at least End Transmission, it was a bit more kind of high and low. It's not just like in your face hardcore like Hatebreed would be. And yeah, it would just always stand out as just something special. It's not a type of kind of hardcore that I super connect with. But when I put it on, like especially End Transmission, that's the one I know the most of theirs. Like, it just kind of pulls me back to that time, and that intensity is just, I don't know, there's something really special about them.
Yeah. This era. I mean, I don't want to be the guy who's like, oh man, Aaron, you missed it.
I'm sure I missed a lot.
But this era, and in the Northeast, I mean, they're also from Buffalo, New York. So like, that's like, from where I grew up, that's maybe 8 hours drive. But like, they were out to play Boston and, Connecticut, New York City often. And I mean, there was just such an energy, and man, again, it's like the spirit of this band, which this record captured so completely. And if they recorded it in 2 weeks and dudes were sick, of course it had to. Right. I mean, it was really just what was there.
Yeah.
But like, it brings me this feeling of anticipation, the sweaty palms and the like, oh man, am I standing in the right place? Like, am I going to, get to really like eke out everything I want to do at this show? It just makes me feel like a kid that way. And yeah, so it was fun to actually think back on this one and put this one on the list.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, to follow that up, we've got Grade, Under the Radar. This is the third full-length studio album by hardcore band Grade. It was released by Victory on October 12th, 1999. This is Grade a Canadian band?
Grade is a Canadian band. You should know that, man.
Yeah, well, yeah, I thought so. I mean, I've heard it lots, and people mentioned it, and it's one of those bands I've kind of gone to here and there, but just never really dived into. So yeah, I was aware they were Canadian. I just wanted to ask before stating it because I wasn't 100% sure. But
Sure.
yeah, again, 1999, a little bit before, kind of things were really kind of exploding. But yeah, how did you get into contact with this one? Why does it stand out to you?
Yeah, grade. Man, I couldn't tell you the show exactly that I saw them, but I I want to say it might have been with Boy Sets Fire,
Oh yeah.
who also put out several albums after the Eulogy was on Victory, wasn't it?
Oh, I
I'd
don't
have
know
to
their
look back.
discography enough, but
Anyway, but awesome band and fantastic, like really interesting mix of melodic and aggressive vocals and politically minded and blew my head wide open in a whole other way. But I want to say it was a show that Grade opened for Boy Sets Fire. Either way, I could be off because at that time I feel like I saw both of those bands cross paths quite a bit. But Grade, when this album came out, it just was so cool, and it broke every rule and expectation I had for hardcore. I just had never heard anything like as emotional as this. Are you familiar with the record at all? Like,
yeah,
have you?
yeah, I've listened to. Yeah, it's definitely a
Okay.
lot more melodic and
It's super melodic. There's lots of rock and roll influence. Um, Kyle, the vocalist, has like an unbelievable, like guttural scream that then goes into this what would have been very like typical, late 90s emo, and not emo like Get Up Kids, Promise Ring,
right. Yeah.
Midwestern US emo. I mean more like the emo that we had on the East Coast, which was like very screamy, very like,
Saying that they weren't
exaggerated
spazzy
emotions.
and yeah.
Yeah, bands like, like Texas Is the Reason, and even more so like a band called Garrison would be a good example, like a Boston band that put out on Revelation early on. But anyway, long story short, I just, there was something that they did to meld like, this No Idea sound, like hot water music, Small Brown Bike with, a more produced hardcore and all this melodic stuff. And then on top of it, I was entering, last couple of years of high school, like the relationship drama made more sense and those lyrics resonated, so it's like, it was just his first record where, they were almost like, like love and heartbreak songs that had this intensity. And I think the other piece was that they had such good structure, like verse, chorus, bridge, verse, chorus type stuff. And the songs were just super catchy, memorable, and seeing them play, like, it just all came together and clicked. Like another band that, to me was made on how this stuff translated into a room. And yeah, I played this record out. I absolutely loved it. And it's probably led to too much a use of like octave chords for like, guitar melody and all that kind of stuff that got overdone. But they were, to me, they were one of the first bands to really lean into that. I mean, even Means, I would have nailed you for like having to love Grade because they're, like unbelievable Canadian band. Plus, Means had all these like, kind of punky octave chord type, mid-tempo, two-step drum kind of stuff. And
Yeah.
these guys seemed to me to write the book on it. That's what it introduced to me at the time.
Yeah,
I
it's
loved it.
interesting. I don't know if it was just because they were like from the East Coast, or East, I mean Ontario, kind of East-ish, but like I never remember them coming through Canada. Like I'm sure they did, but there was bands from the West that kind of came a lot more often. And yeah, I don't know. I don't remember hearing of this band that much, really.
Sure.
Especially in comparison to bands like Silverstein and some of those. I mean, they were on Victory, at that time as well. And so
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. Just one of those bands that kind of flew under the radar for whatever reason.
Sure. I don't think they toured as much as a lot of other bands, and they put out a record after this. And I think that they toured the cycle for that and then went inactive, or, you know, at least weren't very busy. I mean, compared to a lot of other bands that would come through the Northeast, especially being from Eastern Canada, you know, they weren't as busy or as frequent. So, you know, it could be that too. But yeah, man, this is like, you know, hallmark sound of an era. And I feel like all of these records so far, and the ones that are forthcoming here in the 5 that I'm offering you, they also change it. A lot of the reason I felt like, you know, they were important were for me, first and foremost, but also it was so clear and direct the impact that they had, and how not just music on Victory, of course, but just like how the scene responded, and lots of not bands didn't just like copy them and, you know, stamp and print, you know, the same stuff. I mean, some did for sure. I mean, that's always how it was, but there were key ways that they just kind of changed the possibilities, you know. And Grade was definitely one of those bands. Definitely, I mean, even out here, one of the bands that people would say, I mean, I would always say it was underrated, because a lot of people would probably be in your camp and say, yeah, I never really got into them. Yeah, I saw their name, but just never had the chance or whatever.
Well, I mean, there's lots of bands I love where it's the same thing, right? It just sometimes it's just the right place at the right time, or, you know, you have a friend that's really into them, or, you know, in my case, I didn't have anybody that was really into them, so it just wasn't kind of an influence on me. So, but yeah, it's a really cool pick, because I think it's one that probably, you know, especially with the discography as big as Victory, could easily kind of get lost, because, you know, maybe they didn't blow up the same as some of the other bands, but lots of really great stuff in there.
For sure.
Yeah, so next one we're moving on to is Thursday's Full Collapse. So this is the second album from Thursday, released April 10th, 2001 on Victory. Full Collapse helped to establish Thursday as an immensely popular group in the indie and alternative rock music scene. They reached 178 on the Billboard 200 and provided some of the earliest mainstream exposure to post-hardcore. I feel like I can still remember when this band came out, and just they were blowing up, you know, on Warped Tour, and they were never one that I could get into as much. So I think at this point, you know, I had kind of, I was still into punk, but now was kind of into heavier stuff. And I don't know, it was just something about Thursday that I just couldn't kind of really connect with. But I mean, it was everywhere. They were one of those bands that, you know, they were exploding everywhere. You go to shows, they were playing it, you know, on the PA, and I mean, it's a great record. It's not that I don't enjoy it by any means. But yeah, I would love to hear kind of how this album influenced you, or what stood out to you on this.
Yeah. Well, I got into this band before this record came out, probably not by long. There was probably, looking back, it was probably like, I mean, it was just by circumstance. I think I went to see, there was this melodic pop punk band that was on Tooth and Nail called Element.
Oh yeah, Element 101.
Yeah, and I think they had put out something on a Philly-based tiny indie record label called Sofa Records before that, and that's how I kind of knew them. But they played this hole in the wall coffee shop, you know, random spot that it was just this like little railroad space that could have fit like maybe 30 people. And they happened to play it with Thursday. And I just remember being blown away in that context at Thursday's energy. And then, you know, they were everywhere. It was like the cycle for building up the press around Full Collapse began. And they, you know, they were a New Jersey based band. So they were around a lot and they toured constantly. And this album came out and it was like it just appeared in everyone's back pocket. I mean, I don't remember going to buy it. I just remember it was on in my car all the time. I was listening to it constantly. And I loved it. I loved a few things. I'll tell you first and foremost, I loved the drum sound.
Like, do you remember who produced this album?
I would have to say, man, I don't totally recall.
Yeah,
I
maybe you can
have
look
this
it up here.
feeling that it would have been at Trax East, but maybe not. With Kravik or Steve Evans.
Okay.
Not totally sure. If you have the ability, look it up. I'm so
Yeah, I'll
curious.
check it out here.
But the drum sounds, and the guy who was playing drums in the band played this iot wood hooped, like super rich, warm, must have been birch. I mean, it was like just a quintessentially different drum kit in every regard. Big, washy, K-Custom dark cymbals. Sound like a total gear nerd here, but like it was just as a drum, like growing up in being interested in jazz and listening to a lot of like totally different music and then getting into punk and hardcore, I just felt like, wow, this is so different. And the guitar players were completely similar, JCM 800 amps, really warm, pushed, but not like, metal distorted guitars. And,
Yeah.
their tones were just awesome. And they sounded live amazing, except for Jeff's vocals, which were like, they were spazzy and good. But like, it was never, to me, it was never like, oh man, super compelling vocalist, but, awesome, thoughtful, insightful lyrics, really passionate delivery. And,
Definitely.
it's one of those albums that I feel like captured a moment. And they rose in a like meteoric fashion. I mean, over the course of 6 to 12 months, they went from like these tiny hole in the wall joints to like, playing 2,000, 2,500 cap venues and selling out well ahead, and I think they deserve to be. It was something that took hardcore energy into, this new direction that I feel like made paths for bands like, bands that were doing equal amounts of hard work to make paths, but the combination of Thursday and bands like Thrice and Coheed and Cambria, and, it really defined this era that was to come. I mean, I even remember seeing those three bands together in like a venue that fit 250 people. And then, a year later they did a tour and they might have been in arenas or like, theaters. And so, yeah, I feel like it was a quintessential turning point type album. And while I listen to it now and I still love the tones, I still love what it innovated. I mean, it's a little harder vocally on the ears. I feel like, it didn't age as gracefully maybe, and might be the reason a lot of people who could have gotten into it later might have trouble getting back to it. But I also have to say, I super appreciate the fact that like, vocally it was not just processed bullshit,
Yeah.
like it was real, actual performances. A few years later, I mean, every band that would enter the studio would come in and just auto tune the hell out of their tracks. And to me that's just sad and disappointing and unnecessary, because most of these people sing really, really freaking well.
Yeah, and what was cool with them is, like you said, he wasn't like the smoothest vocalist, but he had a special energy to him on stage. And I saw them live on the Taste of Chaos tour, and they were one of those bands that you see them live and it's like, okay, like, at least for me, there's a handful of bands like that where maybe I won't listen to them, but live, like 100%, I'll go watch them. And yeah, there was something just really cool about that band. And just another neat thing about Victory is, even just thinking of Grade, who is, maybe a bit smaller known Canadian band. And then you have a band like Thursday, right? Like same label. I mean, different time, or a few years difference anyways. But just cool the diversity of bands on Victory, some just touring a bit here and there, and then bands like this that were, maybe the biggest of their kind then. It says it was recorded at Big Blue Meanie in Jersey City. I don't see a producer name on here, but I'm not sure if you're familiar with that studio or not.
Yeah, that was, I don't know if it was like a room that people would kind of use for its acoustics. You know, there was a number of records, I feel like, at least for drums and guitars, that people would go there, but I'd never been through. I'm not familiar with, like, you know, who typically worked out of there.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'll have to look into that further because you'd think it'd be a pretty big name producer on a band like this.
Yeah.
But
Well, bear in mind, I mean, they weren't a big name band when they recorded this. They were
yeah, I
they
guess
were
that's
they were
true.
still tiny. And to that point, Victory had never, you know, at least anything they had put out that was attempting to take things this direction never got to the size and to the sort of status that this record did.
Yeah,
And so, you know, where, you know, bands that would follow Hawthorne Heights and you know, Silverstein and others, you know, I don't think that, not to say they wouldn't have had the place, but like they took the ramp that this type of album created and crushed. And then, you know, obviously are awesome bands that, you know, that were writing fantastic music, and, you know, but it really kind of changed what people were willing to expect from Victory, where before that, I mean, dude, you know, you look at like the discography for Victory between 97 and 2000, and really Grade and maybe Boy Sets Fire were the furthest out, you know.
yeah,
And then you had this, and it sort of like, you know, changed things to like, oh, this is indie rock, this is, you know, this can be a rock label. And then, you know, I mean, obviously the with those bands, and, you know, Taking Back Sunday, and I mean everything, it just kind of blew wide open. They became almost like a, you know, I know statistically they were at a time in the mid, you know, the first decade of you know, that new millennium there, or this new millennium I should say, you know, they were like, you know, by figures the largest independent rock label out there for a time.
yeah. It'd be really interesting to hear kind of who, you know, who was behind that or who was making those decisions. Like if it was like, okay, we need to branch out, like try and grow the label, or just take a chance on new bands, or whatever it was. You know, I mean, lots of labels did that. I guess you can only put the same thing out for so long, but you know,
Mhm.
for a label that was more known for heavier stuff to, you know, get a demo from a band like this, and it's like, oh, is this, you know, is this going to fly, or is this just going to flop? Or so
Sure.
I'm sure there was a lot of surprised people there, but you know, lots of cool moments with that, and a band that's going to stand out for sure. So the last one on the list here is Comeback Kids Wake the Dead, which was released on Victory on February 22nd, 2005. Um, yeah, this is one that really hits home for me. You know, at this time, Comeback Kid was still pretty much a Winnipeg-based band, which we mentioned. You know, wasn't too far from here, so they always kind of felt like somewhat of a local band. I was friends with the guy who was playing bass on Turn It Around.
Is that Cliff?
Yeah, Cliff.
Yeah, he was a cool dude.
And so, I mean, yeah, I'd seen them a few times, kind of smaller shows, and but yeah, then they signed to Victory, and were kind of, you know, getting a lot more exposure and more tours, and yeah, this album is just such a game changer. You know, it continues to be a melodic hardcore staple and a fan favorite, and was just such a step up from Turn It Around. I mean, that album is awesome, but this one, you know, just the songwriting and the quality of production, and yeah, I think this is a really good example. And I've talked to Cliff lots about. So he left the band kind of when this album was coming out, but I always just love hearing him talk about this era, and you know, just everything happening at the right time. And yeah, it was so many cool stories from that. So why did you pick this album from them?
I picked this, yeah, because I love the band. You know, it's interesting because this brings us to an era that was sort of beside, you know, the busiest era for With Honor when we were out. And, you know, with Comeback Kid, our paths crossed and we became fast friends, and we did lots of touring together before this record, and then after this record. In fact, you know, one of the best tours and most fun tours we ever did was with Comeback Kid, beginning, you know, March 5th. And I believe the tour began in Toronto, but March 5th, 2005. And it was their tour for this album. And it was Comeback Kid, Bane, With Honor, and Silent Drive. And it was like 6 weeks long, and just an unbelievable defining type of tour.
Yeah, sounds amazing.
Yeah, and I mean, it was just part of why I picked this album is the band is definitive. I felt like, Victory kind of came back to hardcore with this album, and then, bands like With Honor and others that would come, like they made sort of like a re-up. Once Thursday snapped and they went in this, more kind of rock and melodic direction, they really didn't put out too many hardcore records. So for people like me who's, defining records, were Snapcase and Hatebreed and Earth Crisis, and, the label changed dramatically. And that was partially like that the scene had changed a lot and they wanted to grow, I'm sure. And they saw all sorts of opportunity and success. It makes complete sense. Don't get me wrong. But when they got a hold of Comeback Kid, and then Comeback Kid, with their Face Down release, Turn It Around, before this, they just were, exploding, by the week. And then, they put this record together, which delivered. It was awesome. And just like such a refreshing combination of so many elements in hardcore that I love. Melodic, energetic, positive, lots of bounce, and it was just so much fun.
Yeah.
Well beyond just like cheap mosh and, singing along to some, just destructive, negative crap. And so loved it. And then, obviously to see friends experience the kind of success with it, and to be out on that tour, it was just insane. The first week we were, it was like Toronto, Montreal, Quebec, Boston, New York, Philly, DC. And to sell out like everywhere, including CBGB's before it closed. And, you're just like, it was an awesome moment for the band. And those songs were the reason why. It just crushed. And those 6 weeks just followed suit that way everywhere we went. It was awesome. And so, I just think it took melodic hardcore into a whole new place, and kind of introduced, a scene that was vibrant and that was thriving in its own right, but it connected it on a whole other level. And I think, loads of bands like us had Comeback Kid and this release to thank for that.
Yeah. And what's so cool about them is just, they're essentially kind of, hardcore legends now. They've been around for so long. At least in my opinion, every album they put out is amazing. They'd be in my top 5 favorite bands. And it's just, it's really cool seeing a band, kind of like Hatebreed for you, like, for them, seeing a band that I wasn't, super close with any of them, but just a band that was from this area, gaining exposure, that's still going now. I know a few of them enough that, when they come through, like, you hang out or chat for a bit, and so kind of, it has that personal vibe to it, but, then you'll see them playing these big festivals in Europe, and I don't know, it's just really cool to see a band like this that, isn't very mainstream sounding by any means. They're not hard to listen to, but, they've never tried to go light or add singing or all that kind of stuff. And so, awesome band, and they just always have so much to offer. I love them so much.
Yeah, classic, completely cool.
So we're going to end here talking about one of my favorite Victory Records albums, and that is With Honors, This Is Our Revenge. And
what? No.
Okay, never
really?
mind. Oh, dude, yeah. Well, this album came out 2005 as well, right? So it's kind of same year as Wake the Dead. So you guys just had the one full length out, just Heart Means Everything. Was that the only other kind of major album you had up before this one?
That was the only other full length. We had a demo 7-inch that we put out. Then we did the full length, and then we did a split 7-inch, like another short, 3-song split 7-inch and release. And then we went in for this full length. Yeah.
And so how did you guys get connected with Victory and sign with them between Heart Means Everything and this album? Was it
Yeah.
kind of a natural progression, or how did that come about?
Yeah. I mean, I'll try to go through it. I mean, it wasn't so much a natural progression. I mean, we were really fortunate to have bands that took us out, and that, we got to tour with everyone from, Bane and Comeback Kid, like I mentioned, to Sick of It All and Agnostic Front. And, I mean, it was, Hatebreed, and so many friends, so many good trips. And so, the band was growing, and we knew that we needed to put out a record on a label that had, larger distribution networks than Stillborn, which was awesome, and, put out our first record. And, Jamie was really gracious and knew this. So, we kind of were shopping around, just to have the opportunity at the very least to have a wider distribution, because, at that time still people were buying CDs. That was totally normal. So yeah, I think, the year prior we were touring a ton, and we were coming across people, and this melodic hardcore, like Comeback Kid and like With Honor, was starting to show that it had legs, and it was getting really popular. And so the labels were very interested to talk to bands like us. And so we were talking to a number of different labels, and, we had our hesitance getting in with Victory for good reason, loads of stories that we're not mentioning. And, things went the way they did, which will also be a story that would be a waste of time to get into. But yeah, they just presented an opportunity, the legacy of the label, even at that time, or I should say more the lineage, they, even despite, negative press that they had gotten, with different disputes and issues, they had put out some of, the foundational hardcore records that we were into. And so, when we could compare different offers, from the various folks we were talking to, it was the one that made the most sense, that gave us the size and the scale for reach, in terms of like reaching new people and being able to reach people internationally, and as compared to some of the other labels we were talking to, which would have had the same reach but didn't have the background or the trust of the hardcore community looking back, and so that's, I think, a big reason why we went with that.
Mm. And what do you remember about the writing and recording of this album? So that you guys recorded this with Brian McTurnan, that's right?
We did, yeah. Who is amazing.
Yeah,
And
we had him on here not too long ago on the podcast, and yeah, man, that guy's crazy. What was that experience like?
it was amazing. Yeah. I listened to that episode because I'm a huge fan of the Be Well record that
so
came
good.
out this year. Super into it. I adored working with Brian. I thought it was the best recording experience by far. And I mean, to say by far is just a gross understatement. We had been really lucky. I mean, we recorded our demo with Adam D from Killswitch Engage.
Oh yeah, right on.
We recorded our first full length with Kurt from God City Converge. We've recorded tons of demos with like Greg Thomas at Silver Bullet Studios, who's done Misery Signals and Shia Sense and, all sorts of cool stuff.
Yeah.
Plays in the band End, amongst other things.
Yeah, awesome guy.
Yeah, unreal. And so, there's no shortage of great people, but there was something, and I think it was really just where I was at and Brian's resonance, I think it was just that the right thing at the right time. And I speak, particularly for me, like that experience for me was exactly what I needed, and it was definitive. Obviously, the sound that we kind of innovated for that record was way beyond what we had done prior. It was much more punk and melodic, and it was me trying to stretch myself vocally in ways I hadn't. And he just created an environment that, removed all pretense. And I felt like it was the most creative and positive a process that I had been a part of. Whereas prior, everything was very like, okay, cool, we're getting it done. And I don't think that was the result of who was, at the helm. I think it was just kind of where we were as a band, our lack of, a firmly set identity for what we were doing. And, but yeah, it was one of the last projects that was recorded at the Beltsville studio, the classic studio. And I mean, I remember getting there and like, I think like the Hot Water lyrics to Caution were like, up on the glass door. Like, Brian was like, yeah, I'm never going to move these, and, you're just like, I mean, to me, because, Brian had recorded so many of the albums and 7 inches all the way back that were, for me, coming up in the Northeast, because he was based in Boston before that, all of the early Bane 7 inches and Give Blood and, and then Thrice's Artist in the Ambulance and Illusion of Safety before that, it just, Strike Anywhere, all these bands that I absolutely love were recorded in that room. And so there was, of course, a gravity to being there that was even beyond just he and Schleibaum, who was doing a lot of the tracking with us, Mike Schleibaum, who's in Be Well and Darkest Hour. Those guys just created space from where I sat that was just the healthiest, coolest. And yeah, I just felt like, that album, we began thinking about that album earlier that year. And I think we were on tour with like Stretch Armstrong and H2O. We came off, then we went out with, Bane and Comeback Kid and Silent Drive for 6 weeks. And we got back, did like maybe like Most Precious Blood and Throwdown or something like that. And then we just like wrote. And I just felt like it was the healthiest time. I felt like there was ink in the pen, so to speak. Like it just felt like the things that I started to write about were really, they mattered to me, and it felt very sustainable and meaningful to sit with them for much longer than life sort of allowed for the stuff prior. It's not to say I'm not proud of it. It's just more, it hit on a whole other level. And so, be it like conflict that was going on in my personal life at the time, or be it, political stuff. I mean, there was plenty happening, and, so it was awesome. Plus we had, probably 3 weeks in the studio, or, 3.5 weeks with Brian in Maryland. It just provided a contour to the experience where, we got to just like kind of really dive headfirst into it in a way that we hadn't for the things that we had done prior.
Yeah, man. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, it was cool. And again, I mean, the cult of personality, and I mean, I of course had this like, man, you're incredible type of vibe walking in the door, but like all of his humanity and just the person that he proved to be dwarfed all that stuff. He's one of the best. And then he's an unbelievably legendary, musician, and producer as well. But I feel like all that compared to the type of person he is and the type of energy he exudes is, pales in comparison.
Yeah, right on, man. Yeah, thanks for sharing all that. I mean, there's so much more cool stuff we could get into, and maybe we can do that some other time. But
sure.
To kind of wrap up, have you been involved in any other kind of musical ventures the last few years, or where are you at with music these days?
Oh man, I mean, I listen to a lot of it. I spin plenty of records. I write songs. I mean, over the years I played in some various like indie projects. I've written a lot of songs. My main crowd right now are 5 and 9 years old, and I sing them to sleep most nights.
You mean scream them to sleep?
No, not so much. I mean, but yeah, the crowd has changed over the years. But yeah, man, music, it's always there. It's just like, how much I've been able to be involved. There's been different seasons, for With Honor and Life in Your Way, both, that we've gotten together and done various things. This past year, pre-COVID, With Honor was slated to get together to celebrate our 15-year anniversary for Revenge. So,
oh man,
we had actually been working on some reissues on the albums, which are still in process. And Yeah, we were gonna play and still intend to play whenever it does happen, Furnace Fest, the revamped Furnace Fest. And we'll probably do dates around that.
Yeah,
But
awesome.
then of course, because you start thinking about that stuff and then you start like trading song ideas and, there's some things cooking, but I mean, where it'll go, who knows? I mean, I can't really say. But it's exciting, to touch that energy again. And I think everybody in the band, which, is very unusual that any band has all of its original members and never really operated, for a significant amount of time, at least, without them. We have kind of all reconnected and for the first time are like, oh man, it'd be cool to just like trade ideas and, put some things together and see what happens. So, might be something around the bend. We'll see.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Todd, it's been a pleasure getting to hear these stories and connect again. And we've been trying to make this happen for a bit. So yeah, this is awesome. It brings me a lot of joy and so fun just talking about music and just music that influenced us. And even though, like you said, we're kind of past that point of our life where we're really pursuing it or getting into it, but I don't know, at least it seems like it's still a big influence on your life and it's still kind of a part of who you are. And so that's really cool to see that.
Oh, it's huge. It's pivotal. I mean, getting into like starting my own business and, being a parent. I mean, it's like all the most important things, like my family and doing my very best, just like waking up and, learning from mistakes, falling on your face, picking yourself back up. I feel like punk and hardcore are definitive voices in a consistent, ongoing way to like what it takes to just get through life, and let alone to aspire to like thrive in life. So yeah, man, I'm forever grateful. And I absolutely appreciate the opportunity to join you and your listeners, and just kind of hobnob on With Honor and Victory Records, and wish everyone and you the very best with it.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, that's funny you mentioned that about punk and hardcore. Like I've never really thought about that before. Usually it's parents saying like, oh, what are you doing, you're wasting your life. It's like, hey, I'm getting these skills that people take years to learn. Like who knew that playing crappy shows and sleeping on floors and all this stuff would set you up, like whether it's to start a business or to become a parent or something else in life that is hard to do and takes struggle, but is also so rewarding at the same time. So that's a really cool idea. I've never really thought about that before. So yeah,
man,
awesome.
I'd be lost without it.
Yeah, well, that's a good way to end. And thanks so much again. It's been awesome.
Ever seen a duck fight? No way. Why? Because the other animals are afraid. They know that if they mess with one duck, they got to deal with the whole flock.